So, then back to school again, and the war was over, thank goodness. But I think everybody was very drained and felt pretty exhausted by the war.
So the house you were renting afterwards,
my parents were fortunate. We stayed in that house. My parents were, after the war, they were able to buy it, which was good. So they bought the house, presumably at a much reduced price because they were sitting tenants. I'm not quite sure about that period. What was I, 13 when the war ended, 12, 13 when the war ended. I think in my family, everybody got ill as soon as the war ended. I think, everybody had been living... My father, of course, had the paper that he worked for, the Sunday Referee, which was a paper a bit like the Observer, Sunday Observer is today, or the Sunday Times. The paper had to close down because of paper shortages. Lots of papers merged. My father then didn't, because he was a foreign correspondent, there wasn't a job for him anymore, specialising in Germany. So he went to the BBC. And my father spent the rest of his career at the BBC. And it was interesting because he was one of the few people at the time of the Yalta Conference, which was the conference between Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, right at the end of the war. He was one of the few people at the BBC who'd actually been to Yalta at that time, and we had a little record of the talk he gave. And he also gave a talk on the BBC about the mayor of Hamburg before Hitler had installed his puppet head of Hamburg.
Were there any sort of ramifications? Because you had a lot of connections with people living in Germany at the time during the war.
Oh yes, well of course. I mean, we didn't know anything. My poor mother didn't know anything that was happening to her family, and as they didn't know what was happening. So when, as you can imagine, Hamburg was bombed very severely, and in fact my mother's sister actually gave birth on the blazing streets of Hamburg. She was trying to run to a shelter, and she had twin girls, one of whom died at that time, but my mother of course knew nothing about it. And it was after the war, one day I answered our front door, and there was a little RAF airman standing on the doorstep, and he said, "I've just come from Hamburg. Are you the family Craik?" My maiden name was Craik. "I've got a message for you from your cousin, my mother's niece, Edith." And she'd been going out with this RAF airman when he was in Germany. And she asked him to come and see us and find out how we were. That was nice, wasn't it? So, I mean, he didn't even know, he had to find our address because we weren't obviously living in the flat that she last knew, but he managed to find us and he brought us greetings. So, and also, the other thing was that my father had another speciality. He was very interested in railways. At one point in his many varied career, he'd been involved in the railways, and he was made a lieutenant colonel. He was promoted quite a lot from his second lieutenant in the First World War, sent to Germany to do a survey of the state of the German railways, because you could not go immediately after the war. You could not go into Germany unless you were in uniform. You had to be in uniform. Private citizens couldn't go. And so my father then went to Germany and did his survey on the state of the German roads, managed to get to Hamburg and find my mother's sister. My mother's mother had died during the war, and in fact she'd had a bad time because she was brought in front of the tribunal to prove that she wasn't Jewish. And she was able to provide what they call burger briefs, which means that her family were freemen of the city of Hamburg in the past, and she'd got these papers, and of course you couldn't have been able to be a freeman, even in the pre-Hitler days, you had to be non-Jewish to be a freeman. And so, but because she was very dark-haired, and she'd been brought in front of the tribunal to prove she wasn't Jewish. Terrible times. My mother's sister had desperately tried to keep her son out of the Hitler Youth, feigning that, claiming he had measles, chickenpox, every time, but in the end he had to join. There wasn't any alternative. My mother had two half-brothers from my grandmother's first marriage, and one of them had been in the First World War and had his eardrum shattered on the Western Front. At the end of the Second World War, he was sent to the Russian front, even though he was now totally stone deaf, and he disappeared forever. No one ever saw him again. My other uncle, my mother's half-brother, he had one daughter who I suppose you would now say, I think she probably was Down syndrome. I'm not absolutely certain. I have a very vague memory of her as a little girl who wouldn't play with me. But I think she must have had Down syndrome. She was certainly mentally handicapped in some way. Well, she was exterminated by Hitler. He got rid of all mentally disabled people. Sent to Vienna, told she was going on holiday, and my uncle was so upset, as you can imagine, more than upset by it, that he started shouting and screaming abuse about Hitler, and I'm afraid they executed him. So my mother didn't know all this was going on, of course.
She had family on both sides.
So I mean, my mother could not have been more proud to be British than that. Of course, she'd come to England, as I say, long before the rise of Hitler, and she'd come from a very socialist family, so they were all terribly against Hitler, but of course there wasn't much they could do, and as you can see, they also suffered.
How long was it before your family was able to get in contact?
Oh, well, that was... So my father was able to go to Hamburg, make sure that my mother's sister and the one surviving twin and her older sister, they were all right. My aunt's eldest son had managed to avoid going into the army, but had been sent as an engineer, because he was an engineer, to Blohm and Voss, the submarine base in Hamburg, where in fact my uncle had worked long before the war there as an engineer. Because Hamburg being a port, most people had work to do either with the port, either with the sailing or with working in some degree with the port. So my mother then eventually, people were allowed, civilians were allowed to go. My mother was able to go to Germany and see her sister and be reunited, so that was nice. I didn't go for some years late. I was well into my 20s when I went back, but and they were able to come over here. And I remember, first of all, my mother taking over tea and coffee there, because they were terribly short of those things immediately after the war. So that was that part of my life.